My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And today we are tagging along with the intrepid peasants of Sailors on the Starless Sea.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. All right, Tom, tell us about Sailors on the Starless Sea.
Okay, Sailors on the Starless Sea is a zero-level adventure written for Dungeon Crawl Classics, written by Harley Stroh, edited by Aaron Rudell, and with art by Doug Kovacs, Jim Holloway, Russ Nicholson, and Stefan Poag. I think that has 2 syllables. I'm basing that on a guy I went to school with whose name was Paul Boag with a B, so yeah. Anyway, it's a funnel adventure, more on which later, where the PCs are a group of peasants headed into a monster-infested castle to rescue their fellow villagers from a recently reactivated evil cult of Chaos Beastmen. There's a fairly straightforward sequence of encounters, and you can expect them to happen in roughly the following order. The first thing is that you approach the castle, and it's fallen in drawbridge, and there are some plant monsters called vine horrors here that inhabit human corpses. Then you have the above ground but within the castle section, so you have to fight some beastmen, and there's a tar ooze, a kind of blobby tentacled thing lurking inside an ancient chapel. Then you get underground into the sort of dungeon section, so this was a couple of subterranean chambers used by the cult in years past, and you can learn more about what's going on in here. There's no combat necessarily in this bit. And then the bottom level, and the part that gives the module its name, is the Starless Sea, a huge underground lake with a magic monolith on the near side and a magic ship to take you across to the far shore, and lurking underneath its black waters, a big chaos leviathan. And then on the far shore is where your kidnapped villagers are, on a ziggurat-shaped temple, and that's where the big boss monster showdown happens, assuming that you actually make it that far. There is a kind of scripted denouement, if all goes well, which launches the PCs in a frantic escape from a collapsing dungeon on the ship, which could take them back to the village or to absolutely anywhere. And there's also a side puzzle, which is worth mentioning, involving a magically frozen tomb, which is sort of related to the main plot, but not really. That, again, is just there to generate connections to future adventures, I would say.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about what we liked about Sailors on the Starless Sea? I'll start. So I think presentation is something we have to mention here. This is not something specific to Sailors on the Starless Sea. The newer DCC modules, I have a bunch of them, they all kind of succeed in this way. But I think the presentation is really beautiful on this module. It has lots of scripted parts that the GM reads to the players, which I don't always love in modules, especially like the older ones, like back in the B1 days or whatever. They were a little too much, in my opinion. They were the language was a little over the top, and they were just kind of a slog, in my opinion. But these are quite concise and very scripted. Physically, there's no wasted space in this book. I mean, they put their margins to use in these DCC modules. The map, like there's a map on the back end of the book, and there is just stuff tucked all over the page, right? You have the main map, but then there's like pictures of the various monsters that might show up. Mm-hmm. There is a side view, sort of like, what do you call that? Like a cutaway portion of the map, a side, there's a side view of the map that kind of shows like how it all looks, in that orientation. Just all like really, the space is all used really well. The handouts are really lovely. The art is fantastic. And one thing that I love about DCC modules, because I've used a bunch of them, not necessarily to run DCC, but I've used elements from them in my other games. They're super easy to photocopy. You can take them to the photocopier. They're really easy to photocopy because they're pretty thin, flat books, and they're the size of a photocopy paper. And so they're super easy to just photocopy and get the bits that you need, so you don't actually have to tear up the book itself or anything. So I just love that aspect of it. What do you think about presentation?
I can only agree. I love the DCC art style in general. A lot of that is Doug Kovacs is kind of the leading mad genius on that front, and it does really pull together this idea of I was going to say swashbuckling adventure, but it's not really. It's that sort of chaotic Fritz Lieber, anything could happen next kind of vibe, you know?
I agree. When I look at DCC modules, I get a sense of like 1960s, 1970s, almost like weird fantasy more than like a high fantasy vibe from looking at the art. Although it's drawn in a very like kind of old school, kind of black and white style, I guess. But that's kind of my feeling on it anyway.
Yeah, I agree. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see kind of airbrushed onto the side of a panel van. Often.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's like a perfect analogy. Yeah, that's great. So presentation, that's not anything specific about Sailors on the Starless Sea. That's kind of true of all of the newer DCC modules. As far as this particular module, I love the narrative beats in this one. It starts with a very classic funnel setup, right, of villagers heading into a dungeon because they're plainly idiots. But like villagers heading into it.
That's fair enough.
Yeah. They're villagers heading into a dungeon for whatever reason, usually to save the village or rescue people. Pretty standard. They're in a ruined keep. Again, kind of a standard sort of dungeon crawly sort of thing. But then they start to go underground, and then they get to the Starless Sea sequence, and it becomes like kind of terrifying and epic, right? Like the way it's described as this like subterranean ocean almost, right? And you're just imagining this vast black tract of water, like in total darkness. And you have this, you have this huge, like the huge men here. You have the boat, you've got the tentacle monster in the middle, leading up to this big ziggurat, like out in the blackness, with these like crazy frothing beast men. I mean, it's just a huge epic setup at the end, and it just feels really scary and special. I love that part of it. And I love that build, like
it creates a sense of wonder, doesn't it? That sort of going from the recognizable but scary, and the more you go down, the older things get, the more they open up. The physical spaces become larger, and thus, there's nowhere to hide, I think, is a part of the psychology of that last sequence. You've been able to sort of hide around corners and do things room by room so far, and then suddenly there you are in this huge, dark space.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So that's probably my favorite thing about the module. And then another thing that I like about it is that there's an emphasis in the text on things that might reverberate into the characters' futures. And I like that a lot because I think it deepens the story significantly. In my opinion, a lot of the funnels I've seen can be a bit shallow. Like it's mostly just about like kind of mowing through the PCs, in like gruesome ways, right? And I like that this one has a few instances where it really wants you to consider the character's actions because it might have implications for their future, right? So you have that Band of Fire artifact, which is a pretty cool magic item. But if you take that, like the text suggests that like your characters may have challenges from other adventurers coming their way just because they chose to pick that up, right? There are a number of instances where your character's dedication to either law or chaos is sort of challenged, and that can have like further consequences for your character in the future.
Yeah, and the other one is that the side puzzle of the Frozen Tomb, and if you take the artifact from there, you wind up with two curses, which are not exactly specified in the text, and are left for the GM to come up with, and they will follow you as you go about your future business as well.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's an aspect of a funnel, which I think is really important because to me, a funnel like points to the future, right?
Yeah,
it should.
Yeah. And also, I mean, even within the module, things from the higher levels point downwards as well. So, there's each problem that you come across, you do have an opportunity to pick up the answer to it in some respects anyway. So like the Leviathan, there's a thing that can put it to sleep if you are sharp enough to pick it up before you get there, that kind of thing. So that is a good way of not just making it into a meat grinder. It's not a trick. It's not just a trap that you wander into. It is a bit of a puzzle that you could have a decent stab at making it through, if you're lucky, maybe.
Indeed. Well, so Tom, what did you love about the module?
Well, I think it does relate again to the narrative beats. I like how it starts with quite low-key challenges. One of the first things you have to do is get into the castle, which, because the drawbridge has fallen in, is much more difficult than you might think. And that's a great early team-building moment as everyone stands around going, what do we do now? And, come up with different plans about how to cross that bridge. I mean, going back to the village and getting some planks, you would think would be the obvious answer, but that doesn't seem to come up very often. And then at the other end, it does what lots of really good DCC adventures do, which is it doesn't wait for you to get to high levels before it throws in big cosmic stuff. As you allude to about getting to the Starless Sea. And yeah, you're at level 0 and you're already facing Chaos Lords who want to take over the world and stuff. You don't have to run around and kill 100 rats for XP just because you're a peasant. A few of the adventures in the DCC series do that. One that I've played in was Intrigue at the Courts of Chaos, which is a level 1 adventure, and it sends you plane hopping between the planes of chaos and law, even though you've only got 12 hit points each. It still finds stuff for you to do and,
right.
and have these epic adventures. So that's pretty good, I think.
Right. Yeah. I love that about the DCC modules too. The one of the main reasons why I do purchase a bunch of them, and even though I don't run DCC, I use a lot of the elements from them because they are wildly imaginative and creative, and because the funnel ones especially were built for like lower level characters to like kind of go through, they're interesting and they can be applied to lots of different like fantasy adventure party situations, right? Like you can kind of like take them and play with them and make them apply to characters of any level in whatever game you're playing. I just like the sort of, I like the space that DCC plays in, right? Which is like you said, which is to say, we reject this notion that your fantasy adventure at low levels has to be about skeletons and rats, right?
Yeah.
Like, I just think it's really great. It's what makes them so compelling.
So the next bit is things we have questions about. And my question to the world in general is, how likely is this to be a total party kill, a TPK? And if it's very likely, how undesirable is that? And I think at this point, I should maybe take a moment to explain what a funnel adventure is for listeners who maybe don't know. So what you're expected to do, the default method of character creation in Dungeon Crawl Classics, is that you generate a bunch of normally 4 0-level characters per player, and they are generally unskilled or semi-skilled workers of various types, swineherds, elven artisans. Halfling tailor, I believe, is one of them, who comes with a set of pinking shears and some cloth. Yeah, and they each have, one item appropriate to their career. And you send them into a dungeon or other adventure. And the theory is, the ideal outcome, I think, is that you end up with all but one character per player killed off. And then whoever survives then becomes a level 1 adventurer and gets a proper adventuring class. And then you go on from there. However, a lot of funnels can be pretty lethal. When I ran this particular one, Sailors on the Starless Sea, I got a total party kill, which was fine because it was a one-shot. But yeah, how do you deal with that? How do you sort of come out to that quote-unquote correct outcome?
Well, that was my big question about this one too, is can characters actually survive it? Because it's really deadly, right? I mean, almost from the start, they're fighting things that can kill them in 1 or 2 hits, And then you've got a number of traps. You've got it's just a parade of like bad instant kill or near instant kill things, And so, yeah, I just wonder, I have that question too, can characters actually survive it? I have, you did it in a one shot and so it wasn't like such a big issue for you. I've never run this module, but I have used elements from this module for my other games, but not in the context of a funnel. I have played in funnels though, and I actually have not ever played in a funnel where the goal was to then have the character afterwards. Like, we were just playing the funnel for the experience of doing the funnel. And so it didn't really matter if we survived, kind of like your situation. So I have this question. The one thing I know that the module does that I think probably mitigates this possibility that you will have no characters left at the end is there's one portion where a bunch of villagers are hanging up. I think it's in a tower maybe. Yeah,
it's above ground.
They're all hanging up, from hooks or something. Yeah, and And so you can, if you have a player who's lost all of their villagers at that point, you can rescue those villagers and have them be brand new characters. So there's a sort of a system in there to make sure that someone is left at the end. But, yeah, well, so what do you think? I mean, what do we think are like the big, issues there, like in terms of like, can it be mitigated or whatever?
Well, I think one thing is that, you do have to remember that DCC allows you to burn luck, which is something that, unlike other OSR games, would help you to get out of jail maybe once or twice.
Good point.
And the other thing is, there's a quite important line in this particular scenario, which I mostly forgot about at the time until it was too late, which is that the Beastmen at the end are not trying to kill the PCs. They're trying to capture them, take them up to the top of the ziggurat, and throw them into the sacrificial flames, which of course is just a way of getting a not dead player character right up next to the end boss, and therefore able to deal with the problem by, which it didn't occur to me at the time when I was running it. Actually, and the other thing you should not do is what I did, which is run the scenario as a celebrity Big Brother dungeon crawl, because if you have nightly evictions as well as people dying, that means that people who might otherwise be in the party when you get down to the Starless Sea have already been voted off by the public. So yeah, that's something to look out for if you were thinking of doing that.
I think we're going to have to unpack the phrase celebrity Big Brother dungeon crawl a little bit later. Yeah, that makes sense. I can't say much here myself. It's the major question I had, and it's interesting to hear those little insights into the module itself, which are probably there to help mitigate the possibility that everyone will just die. Other question I had, Tom, is, so I don't play a lot of OSR systems. I rarely run them, and I don't often play them. And so I'm curious, there are certain instances in the dungeon. You have the little chapel, the little burn chapel with the tar ooze, and there's an incense burner thing that you can wave around to fill it with smoke, and that will cause the tar ooze to not attack you. I'm curious, what is the mechanical method by which critical bits of information like that can be relayed to the players? Like, how do you normally unfurl that for the players? In the systems I run, like Dungeon World, Discern Realities, that's the move that kind of handles that, right? It's super efficient and it works. And the players know what to do to make it happen, right? How do you unfurl that kind of information?
Well, I think, rules as written, it's mostly a case of the players have to look out for this stuff and figure it out themselves, that this is important. I mean, because you took, like, Discern Realities, what's the question there that would get you the sensor? It would just be, what here is useful or valuable to me, right? There's no, how does this work?
Right.
How do
or what here is not what it appears to be, that kind of
thing.
So
I think probably mechanically, in terms of process, it would be quite similar. You've mentioned the sensor; it's clearly an artifact of some kind, and you start to look at it. I think for a DCC 0-level character, the chances of anyone having rolled a good career to actually be able to decipher what it is, that might be quite low. But I think that you could just about put the pieces together that there's this old chapel, there's a thing that kills people in it. People used this chapel while the killing thing was in there, so they must have had some way of not dying. Maybe it's one of these things in the chapel. But I admit that is a bit of a stretch, possibly, because a lot of these puzzles always seem easy when you're the one reading the pieces laid out for you, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, I've been in puzzle dungeons and dungeons where there's like a solution to the room or whatever, and everyone's just kind of flailing around because either we're just idiots that the writers didn't anticipate, or it's not as obvious as it seems. I mean, is there like a mechanical thing? Like if the characters, I'm not familiar with DCC enough, but like if the characters walk in and see, they say, oh, I want to go look at the sensor, I want to examine that. Do they get to make a roll or something? Like where then the GM tells them something about
Yeah, because I think that would be a skill. I forgot what it's called in DCC, but you can have a skill test normally based on your career or accumulated knowledge, and if you can justify it to the judge, you get it. I see. But actually, I think one of the issues with that particular sensor is that the smoke makes the tar ooze go dormant, and it also can be used to deal with the Leviathan. But the tar ooze is not as tough as it looks, and in fact, I think when we played, they just beat it with chair legs until it died, right? Because it's only got 10 hit points. So you may not need to figure it out for the tar ooze, and therefore you haven't figured it out by the time you get to the Leviathan. So it might be worth making that tar ooze a lot tougher, like let them get their distance and not be killed instantly by it, perhaps. So they have to figure out the sensor first. But that's an untested hypothesis.
Indeed. Well, those are the only questions I had about the module. I mean, it's otherwise seems like a fairly straightforward thing. It's laid out enough to easy. It's laid out to where you can follow everything pretty easily, and it seems like it would all work pretty well.
That's I concur. Let's go to Chain Lightning.
All right, the Chain Lightning round. I'll start. I love the scene where you treat with the Leviathan. I think that's really great. The idea of the boat going out in the middle of the water and you having to honor the terms of a contract that this like ancient chaos creature made with the previous occupants of this dungeon. I think that's pretty great. I love particularly that the module gives you advice and space on like different ways the player characters can approach that encounter. It feels surprisingly freeform for an OSR thing to me, and I really quite like that.
My first one is something we have covered a bit in our discussion so far, but it's just the pacing between the sections. I like how you have moments to take stock, find things out, or sometimes solve a bit of a puzzle before you move on to the next breathless action scene, and I think that's very valuable. And it is another way for the funnel to work out because you can sort of take time to look at who all your different characters are and get to know them a little bit in the brief time that you have together.
There's a detail in the courtyard about a bunch of muddy tracks, and it's set up so that the players think that there are a variety of monsters and animals inside the dungeon because the muddy tracks depict like, snake tracks and hooves and other things, but in fact, it's just different types of beastmen. And I kind of love that little like sort of misdirection.
That's cool. Yeah. And in a related note, I like the random beastman mutation tables they have, and it's very efficient. It's like one column and they're nested tables for different types. Yeah. It's, I like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So obviously random mutation tables are a thing I like.
My last is the final encounter. It's just devilishly good and very epic. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later, but that whole sequence of people being dropped into the fire and this like chaos beast demon thing coming out that you have to fight. It's incredibly epic for a 0 level adventure.
I mean, in an interesting contrast, my last thing is the first encounter, which is with the vine horrors just before you get to the drawbridge. And that is a brilliant bit of, you've done the intro and the villagers made their way up to the castle. There it is. Are you ready to go in? And then the very first thing they come across is this weird seed planting undead monstrosity. And it's a real, we are in serious trouble kind of moment as everybody realizes what's going on.
Awesome. Let's go to the Expert Delve. This is the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
We are discussing avoiding the gonzo funnel. Jason, what does that mean?
The gonzo funnel. Well, at the outset, I think we should say a couple of things. The first is that your playgroup might want a gonzo funnel, in which case that's okay, right? We're going to talk about how to avoid making it be such a gonzo thing. But at the outset, your players may be into that, and that's cool. If that's what you guys are doing, there's no judgment here. Go do it. Have fun. The other thing is, I actually think Sailors on the Starless Sea is one of the more dark and serious and scary funnels I've seen. And so just by the virtue of the content in the module, it might avoid that, right? But kind of peeling back a little more generally, the idea of funnel adventures. I've played a bunch of them, mostly in Funnel World, which is a dungeon world variant that tries to do the funnel thing that DCC does. And I have played in a couple of DCC funnels as well. And they tend to be a little gonzo. And there's good reasons for that, right? You have villagers who are equipped with a pig or a candle, or like a piece of rope, and they're like going, and it's just kind of a silly setup. Like it's an interesting creative constraint, but it's kind of goofy, right? You have characters that are just dying nonstop, right? Like they're just fodder. They're just getting mowed down. Gonzo play happens, right? It becomes a comic thing. It doesn't have to be unavoidable, but you can see why it goes in that direction. And again, lots of people are going to have fun doing that. And that's one of the great joys of doing them if that's what you're going for. But I think we're going to talk about like ways of maybe how, avoiding the gonzo aspect of the funnel, or ways that we have seen, or I should say contexts in which we have seen this sort of like funnel idea be more serious. Does that make sense? So Tom, I'm going to kick it back over to you. Like, what are your initial thoughts here?
Well, I think my very first thought is that avoiding gonzo-ness doesn't mean doing that all the time. And I think one of the dangers that we often fall into when approaching a kind of serious game is that we become very precious about our serious tone, and it's all this, if someone giggles during my Call of Cthulhu investigation, then I failed. And that's not true. I think we're quite well armoured against, dropping out of character or things being funny and then changing moods. So that is not necessarily something to worry about. When something funny happens, it's funny. If something sad happens, it's sad. Humans can cope with these switches in emotion. And I think a good example of that is, coming back to my previously mentioned Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, that was a game, and is a game indeed, full of black gallows humour. There's lots of pretty comical, meaningless death and pain and misery, and sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's not, and it's generally dealt with a bit of, with some, not detachment, but distance and acceptance. And that, I think, is an attitude that you can just apply to a funnel adventure. And so even when someone dies in a faintly silly way, it's still a bit sad. For example, in the Odyssey, not generally regarded as a barrel of laughs, there is one character who dies because he climbs up on the roof of the witch Circe to get drunk, and he falls off and breaks his neck. That's kind of daft and a bit silly, but that doesn't break the mood of the whole thing. And that's an example of how things can be absurd or ridiculous and still not take over the whole tone of your game.
Well, so that kind of dovetails nicely into my first piece of advice here, I think, which is, I think it's really important to have a tone conversation with the table before you begin playing. I know lots of groups don't do it because I play at cons and very often this conversation does not happen. Now in the Gauntlet, my play group, we always have the tone conversation because that's part of our culture, but it's a thing that a lot of gamers don't do. It's super important. And this needle that we're trying to thread here in terms of like emotion, of making space for it to be funny, to have gallows humor, but still always kind of like veer back into the serious and the dark. That's something that I think needs to be discussed, right? And players should know we can have funny moments. We can enjoy and relish and savor a sort of like, macabre ridiculousness of what's going on, as long as we always like bring it close again and make it dark and make it scary. Do you have tone conversations? Is this something you emphasize in your games?
At the beginning of a game, we'll sort of talk roughly about what kind of adventure it is. Nothing too formal, but I think, just a few getting on board with what we're doing, statements we'll do. And that can actually mutate a bit. I think, for example, when you're giving your characters names and saying what they're like maybe someone will suggest something that's not entirely in line with what you were thinking of originally. But as long as everyone is generally okay with it, then maybe you shift that that part of the Venn diagram over slightly to overlap more concepts than it did originally.
Yeah, setting expectations at the beginning of a session I find to be very helpful, and we have procedures in the Gauntlet for how we sort of like do a sort of general expectation setting. It's a little exercise that we do, which maybe I'll discuss on the show in the future. But it's important. And then also checking in, which is kind of what you were saying there just now, like checking in with players routinely to make sure like, hey, on breaks or whatever, are you feeling good about this? Does this feel right? Or you feel like we're hitting the right beats? I think it's okay to have those conversations with players,
Yeah, I agree. Actually, something you mentioned just now as well, I'd like to pick up, which is to do with the idea of just emotional content, which is that I remember being told quite a few times doing 0 level or even 1st level adventurers in DCC, don't get too attached to your character because they won't last long. I disagree vehemently with this. I think it's only fun if
too.
you do get attached to your 0 level characters. That's what makes it good. Yeah. It makes it sort of tragic that they tripped on a step and took 1 hit point of damage and died. It's that's the fun part, isn't it? I think what's the principle that Funnel World adds to Dungeon World? I wrote it down somewhere. Yeah, savour the kindness and cruelty of fate. And I think you can't do that unless you're at least a little bit invested in whatever sketchy backstory you've given to your, milliner who's venturing into a castle.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because I feel like the main way you're going to avoid like really ridiculous gonzo play is if you do care about the characters, right? You have to not want the characters to die. And I think there are a couple of ways we can kind of get there. I have some thoughts on that. These are things that I use in my own play. So at the outset, I think it's worth pointing out that it can be very tricky to make violence matter in role-playing games, right? The genesis of the hobby is killing lots of things, right? Many of the tools that we had available to us in the beginning were all about just like arbitrating combat, right? Like who is going to die? How much hit point damage do you do? It becomes so abstract that you kind of lose sight of these are characters in the fiction that are dealing with particularly gruesome and nasty things, right? These are things that in the real world we would be shocked by. We would be shook, right? Like we would not. It would be difficult to keep going. And so at the outset, it's a tricky proposition, but I think there's some things you can do. I think one thing you can do is a very, very proactive questioning of the players from the GM and even from player to player, questions that help the players explore the villagers' personal motivations for being in the dungeon, as well as questions that get them to recall their life in the village, which ostensibly is what they're kind of fighting to preserve, right? In the case of Sailors on the Starless Sea, at least. And so I think that's always a good habit to get into. Take moments to ask the players, why does this moment X remind you of something that happened in the village? Or one of your fellow companions here does something that you find particularly annoying. What is it? Or how does this encounter remind you of, or how does character X's behavior remind you of what they did to you back in the, back in the village? Just that kind of thing, like constantly pinging the players about, to look back into the character's backstory and to bring that stuff forward. Not everybody will like this type of play. I totally acknowledge that. It may not be the kind of game you're going for, and that's cool. But if you do want to make their deaths seem more meaningful, I think you should start at least laying a foundation for why we should care about them, right? Another thing, and this is a fun technique. When one of the villagers dies, if there's time, like once they get some breathing room, like that breathing space that you mentioned earlier, Tom, stop and have them memorialize the dead character in some way, right? Have a little funeral, right? Or have a little memorial service. Even just something simple like asking the players, back in the village, what was your tradition when a member of the village, member of the community passed away? What would you do? What would you take from their body? What kinds of words would you speak? Were there any particular rituals or rites or behaviors that you would engage in? Start to tease that stuff out. And then whenever a character dies, make them go through that, right? Like make them sit there and think about like the character's life and how their characters would memorialize that character being gone. This is something we talk about on the Gauntlet podcast a lot. Kate and I do in our sort of like little emotional roundtables that we do every now and then, is how to bring that more like emotional kind of play into the game. I feel like that's got to be like, it's a certain style of play, but I think it's a way of really enriching the consequences of what's going on in the funnel.
Yeah. And I think if you're aiming for that party of survivors, for an ongoing campaign, if you're using this as the start of your campaign, even if you're planning a pretty comical gonzo kind of thing, that will build the characters' connections really well, because as we've alluded to, I think the thing that is really good about funnels for an ongoing game is they get to first level and they are already maybe not exactly a team, but they've got these links. They've got each other's backs, right? Because they're like people who went to school or university together, and they kind of know all the stories of the good and bad things that happened when they were all younger. And so even when they're 10th level badasses, they remember what each other were like when they were dorks. So that is, and that's a powerful bond. And so, yeah,
I agree. Yeah. I think that's what we should be aiming for here, right? I mean, what's the point of having this experience if we're not going to take something from it? That we continue on. Like that we keep with us as we continue in our adventures.
Yeah, exactly. So you may end up with something like a college road trip movie with everybody piling in the van and heading for name an American location. I don't know. Palm Springs, is that somewhere people go? And
if they're like 60, yeah.
Well, you don't know how much later this.
If they're like 85,
you don't know how much later this adventure's taking place. And on the other hand,
true. Good point.
Maybe we're doing something like Grey Ranks, where the thing that they will go through is this horrific, traumatizing event, and they come out of it, shattered and scarred, and that's okay too.
That's an interesting idea. Grey Ranks as a funnel.
Well, it is, right? I mean, you end up with roughly 25% of the characters alive at the end. I don't know.
Yeah, we should mention that's Jason Morningstar's game about Nazi-occupied Poland, I think.
Yes, I believe so.
Right?
That kind of youth militia.
Yeah. And the young freedom fighters who are fighting the Nazis.
Yeah.
And they all, most of them, die one by one.
Yeah. Fun times.
Well, so is there anything else we want to discuss here in terms of this idea of the gonzo funnel?
I suppose I should bring up Celebrity Big Brother Dungeon Crawl again.
Oh, yeah.
So,
what is that? Yeah, so explain.
Well, this was a one-shot that I ran where the idea was that you would take the concept of reality TV show Big Brother, the celebrity version, and just run them through, each day run through a different section of Sailors on the Starless Sea as if they were being filmed for TV. And I got a bunch of no longer useful business cards and made little cardboard stand-ups with the pictures of each of the celebrities on and their names, because many of them are pretty C-list at best. And and I had several non-British players who recognised almost no one. And so that was one way to deal with it. And yeah, so they had little tasks to do. So, go and kill all the beastmen or cook pasta for dinner or whatever. And then they could get points. But, you got popularity points by defeating a trap or killing a monster or escalating your romantic relationship with another housemate, and so on and so forth. And that's basically what I did. So I had this ragtag bunch of celebs using the 0-level DCC rules. I just used the usual random generator. And yeah, that was what we did. I mean, I could summarize it. I think I've got my list of how everyone ended here, if I can take a moment to run through it. These celebrity names will mostly be for our UK and Ireland listeners, but what the heck. So, Peter Andre, the Australian pop singer, was the posthumous series victor. He was killed by the Chaos Leviathan. Dirk Benedict from the A-Team, Jack D, Vanessa Feltz, Kerry Katona, and Dennis Rodman were all killed by Beastmen. The heavyweight boxer Chris Eubank, killed by the Tarus. Former politician George Galloway turned to powers of chaos and evicted. Jermaine Greer, evicted. Jedward, killed with a pitchfork.
I know Jermaine Greer, that's what I know.
Okay, yeah. Jedward, killed with a pitchfork by a possessed Jodie Marsh. Former football hardman and now actor Vinnie Jones, killed by the Tarus. Patsy Kensit, killed by a vine horror, she was the first casualty. Adele Lynch of 90s girl band Bewitched, killed by a fireball trap while secretly exploring an ancient tomb. Jodie Marsh, possessed by chaos spirits and taken away by production staff for psychiatric care after murdering Jedward. Katie Price evicted, and Anthea Turner, discovered ancient sorceress ring, gained magical powers, killed by beastmen. So that's, in summary, how it went. And so that was Silly and Gonzo, but I found it interesting that it was Gonzo in a different way. People had connections to these celebrities, the ones that they recognised and picked, based on what they knew about them in real life, whether they liked them or disliked them. So that was an interesting thing.
I love it. Oh, no matter how you have to connect to the characters, I think that's our singular message here.
Yeah, that's the key.
Find the way and do it. Awesome. Let's go to companion adventures.
Gauntlet Con is coming October 20th through 22nd. Registration for patrons is just around the corner, and let me whet your appetite. I'm just going to talk about games here. As you'd expect, There's more powered by the Apocalypse RPGs than you can shake a stick at, with Dungeon World, Sagas of the Icelanders, Apocalypse World, Fallen Empires, Legend of the Elements, Space Worm vs. Moonicorn, Murderous Ghosts, Blades in the Dark, and yes, that's kind of PBTA, Worldwide Wrestling, City of Mist, and Urban Shadows. We've also got Dungeon Crawl Classics, The Black Hack, The Rad Hack, Kalmata Live, a BX game, World of Dungeons, Earth Dawn, and Godbound. Is that not good enough? How about some more? Fate Accelerated, Swords Without Master, Heroes of the Hearth, Tenra Bansho Zero, Golden Sky Stories, Rocker Boys, and Vending Machines. Oh, you'd rather play in some games run by their designers. Oh, how about Monster Hearts and Dream Askew by Avery Alder, Sig by Jason Pitt, Pugmire by Eddie Webb, Alas for the Awful Sea by Haley Gordon, Happiest Apocalypse on Earth by Christopher Gray, Threadbare by Stephanie Bryant, The Veil Cascade by Fraser Simons, High Plains Samurai by Todd Crapper, Dust, Fog, and the Glowing Embers by Slade Stoller, or Melandros by Tom McGrenery. Oh, I see. You'd rather play some bleeding edge games that are still in development. How about Hydro Hackers from Phil Vecchione? Bite Me from Becky Annison, Paul Sega's latest joint, Traverser, Afterlife from Liz C, Sword's Edge, Face Explosion from Fraser Ronald, Awoke from Jonathan Lavallee, Putin by Adam Robichaux, or Cartel from Mark Diaz-Truman. That's just a sample of some of the games. There are more being added. You need to be a patron to be able to get in early, so please sign up on our Gauntlet Patreon site so that you get the announcement when registration goes live. It's going to be awesome.
So it's Companion Adventures, and we have a lot of stuff on the Companion Adventures list for you today, listeners. All right, Tom, kick us off.
Okay, first we have the historical note. So, as best as I can tell, the origin of the Funnel Adventure kind of comes from Treasure Hunt, which was written by Aaron Alston for AD&D First Edition, and you can buy that in PDF from DM's Guild right now. So go and do that if you want to. It's quite similar to any Funnel Adventure. It starts off with all the characters. They are captured by pirates or something. They're on a ship. Anyway, they get shipwrecked. They have an adventure, and stuff that they do during the adventure determines what classes they will end up as when they become adventurers. Jason, I think we both have some films to nominate. Would you like to start?
Films, yes. I'm going to suggest, I've got two films, and really just scenes from these films, not even the whole films. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the film from 1984, which I'm sure we've all seen, as well as a more obscure film from 1965 called She.
Is that the one with Ursula Andress?
With Ursula Andress, that's right. And the reason why I'm suggesting these two is because they both have scenes, which I consider to be very horrifying, scenes of people being dropped into flaming pits in a ritualistic manner. That's something that happens near the end of the module. And so, like, Temple of Doom, when I was a kid, that scene, which is near the beginning of the movie, as I recall, that scene of the people being dropped into the lava, you know, with this like strange ritual going on, scared the fuck out of me. Like, I thought it was terrifying. And the one from She, even though it's a somewhat, well, really very campy
just
sort of sci-fi movie, the scene in She, they have this scene where all of her like slaves or whatever are all chained together, and they're being pushed into this pit as a punishment. And the way it's working is they push just one of them into the pit, and their weight causes the next one to fall in. And then the next one falls in because they're all kind of chained in sequence. And so it's this slow like descent of them all like slowly just being dragged into this pit of fire. It's really
that's
scary.
Great. You could steal that for the end of Starless Sea. You know, specifically one villager goes in every combat round or something.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, you could just totally steal that visual, or if nothing else, just watch those scenes and kind of be reminded of just how horrifying that is at the end of the module. Yeah. It's really scary. What was your film recommendation?
Well, my first one is the only film I can really think of about a bunch of nobodies going monster hunting in a fantasy setting, which is Dragon Slayer from 1981. I don't remember it being amazing, but I do remember it, so I guess that's something. And then that's all I've got to say about that. And then the next thing I have is Titanic, or The Towering Inferno, or, well, you can just, any disaster movie, basically, where we get introduced to these ordinary people in a large block of about 12, and we get to learn a bit about their background. Like that guy who's having an affair with his secretary in The Towering Inferno, and then one by one they die, until a few people make it out at the end. So that's that kind of model of ramping up tension in very short scenes is probably something to look at and try and just kind of reuse those mixes of character moments and sudden dangers in a funnel adventure.
Indeed. You've got a couple more things. Your list is longer than mine, so I'll let you go next.
The other one is just the TV show Lost, which also features a ragtag band of randomly rolled background careers who go into ancient temples and ineptly fight stuff. So, I mean, don't watch all of it. Dear God, do not watch all of it. But maybe season 1.
Oh, that's good. Maybe a bit of a stretch.
But okay. You know.
I'm going to suggest some music. John Carpenter, who is a film director of horror movies, and he's also a composer as well in many of his films. He has put out a number of synthwave albums, which are all quite good. I am one of the people who thinks that synthwave is a more appropriate musical accompaniment for OSR than heavy metal. I know there are a lot of people who disagree with me, but I think synthwave is the right move there instead of heavy metal music. And so John Carpenter's, I see some disagreement from Tom.
No, I like them exactly equally.
Oh, so diplomatic. No, I just dig synthwave as a general matter, and to me, I love this sort of 80s vibe. John Carpenter's Lost Themes album has 3 tracks, which I think, as I was listening to them, I was like, gosh, this feels right for certain moments in the module. The track called Vortex, for when the villagers are kind of setting out to explore the ruins. A track called Abyss, when the villagers begin to explore the top side, sort of ruined keep portion. And then the third track on there I'm going to suggest is Night, which really feels like when the villagers are starting to go underground and they see the black starless sea. Just a bit of mood music.
Cool. And then my final 2 recommendations, they're both just DCC resources, I would say, or funnel adventure resources. The first one is Purple Sorcerer. On their website, purplesorcerer.com, I assume. Just Google it. They have a 0-level character generator, which you just select various options. I recommend 3d6 in order, aka as Crom intended, and it will put out a PDF of 4 randomly generated 0-level PCs with I think you just need to fill in the names, basically. And then the other thing is the podcast Sanctum Secorum, and these guys, basically they do a kind of book club thing. They'll read something out of Appendix N for each episode, and then they go through it, talk about what they liked about it, and then they talk about how to adapt it for Dungeon Crawl Classics, whether it be making up a magic patron, props you could bring to the table, not something I ever would do, but I quite like listening to it. Also media recommendations like, music, that's something maybe another podcast could take that idea and run with it. And then I think the value of this is if you can think of a book that you would like to have the atmosphere of in your Dungeon Crawl Classics adventures or anything else, just pick that episode, listen to it, and they will have some good discussion about it. And I think the fact that it's specifically for DCC actually makes it more valuable in some ways, because rather than it being a general, how would you do this in an RPG discussion, you can think about how the system you're going to use is different from DCC, and that immediately tells you how to fix it for what you want to do.
Yeah, that's good advice. They produce a zine too.
They do, yeah. They're very, very active in the DCC scene, going around all the kind of cons in the South as well, I think. So yeah.
Cool.
Well, that concludes our episode. There's some information about the Gauntlet coming up, and Jason's going to say it.
I am going to say it. We are the Gauntlet. We can be found on the community section of G+. Just go to G+, and search for the Gauntlet. You will find us. We're on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you like what we do, we would appreciate your support on Patreon, patreon.com/gauntlet.
Well, thank you for listening. Thank you, Jason, for being with us.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Tom. Hey, Tom, I've been thinking about the show. I was laying in bed last night having very, very fitful sleep because I knew we were about to record, and I knew that we were still stuck with this awful, awful name, Fear of a Black Dragon, for the show. Any thoughts on what we call it instead?
Actually, yes. How about this? By feather fall means necessary.